Welcome to Digital U.S. History, where you get a comprehensive and informative lesson on a topic in U.S. history. And today's focus is post-World War I foreign policy from the years 1920 to 1933. Now, to set the stage for this lesson, let's look at the two presidents that served the United States in the 1920s. First of all, you had Warren G. Harding. He served as president from 1921 until 1923, and he was from the great state of Ohio. Following him was his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, and he served as president from 1923 until 1929. Calvin Coolidge was from the state of Vermont. Now here is a little more in-depth view of those two people who served as president in the 1920s.
By 1920, Americans were tired of war abroad and progressive programs at home. The high-minded rhetoric of Woodrow Wilson had lost its appeal. The country was in a conservative mood. Number 29, Warren G. Harding, Republican, 1921 to 1923, 55 years old, from Ohio. Warren Harding is the only president to be elected on his birthday. In his successful campaign, he touted a return to normalcy.
We're not going to do anything big and ambitious. We're going to create a period in which things are quiet and calm.
A former newspaperman, Harding was the seventh president born in the state of Ohio. No one ever accused him of being a cold fish. He was an extrovert, a gambler, a drinker, and allegedly a womanizer. He also played the sousaphone.
He liked to be around people, liked to glad hand, liked to slap people in the back. That's actually a rather valuable political skill.
Harding has been portrayed as someone who wasn't fit to be president, that he lacked intellect and ambition.
People will say that he didn't want to be president or that he didn't have the self-confidence to do it. He did want to be president. He was a savvy man in his politics, and he did have a very strong sense for what he wanted to accomplish.
Harding wasn't the type of president who thought he had all the answers.
Mr. Harding said that he was inviting the best minds into the cabinet. In a very real sense, this was the case. His Secretary of State was Charles Evans Hughes, who was a distinguished man. His Secretary of Commerce was Herbert Hoover. This was a good cabinet.
Harding's most important achievement was the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. Passed at Harding's urging, it gave the executive branch greater control over federal spending, and for the first time in history required the president to submit an annual budget to Congress. Harding scored the other great success of his presidency when he convened an international conference in Washington that resulted in an historic arms reduction agreement between the naval powers of the world.
The Washington Naval Conference was the only serious arms limitation arrangement that was made in the 20s and 30s. That was Mr. Harding.
In the summer of 1923, Harding took a train trip west, becoming the first sitting president to visit Alaska. But his health was failing. On July 29th, he arrived at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco and checked into the presidential suite to recuperate. 4 days later, with his wife Florence at his bedside, the president suffered a heart attack. Florence pleaded with the doctors to save him, but it was too late. Harding was dead.
Those people who have any image of Harding at all remember him as a kind of joke, and certainly as a failure. It would be hard for such people to understand the enormity of the response to Harding's death.
It would be a short-lived period of grief and reverence. Less than a year after his death, several scandals came to light that forever shattered Harding's image. The most significant scandal involved Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall. He was accused of improperly leasing Navy oil reserves at Elk Hills, California, and Teapot Dome in Wyoming to a pair of wealthy oil men in exchange for an illegal kickback. Teapot Dome, as the affair came to be known, was the most infamous presidential scandal prior to Watergate.
I don't know of any evidence that Harding actually was complicit in these scandals or that he personally benefited from them, but he certainly was guilty of appointing mediocre, not very honest people to very significant positions.
Harding's reputation was further tarnished by the publishing of two scandalous books. One insinuated that the president's wife, Florence, had poisoned him. Another was written by Nan Britton, a woman who claimed to have had an affair with Harding and given birth to his daughter. These sensational tales were dubious at best, but widely believed at the time. Today, Harding is remembered more for the scandals that swirled around him, both real and imagined, than anything else. One historian who has re-examined Harding's record thinks history has been particularly unfair to our 29th president.
He was a good president, even verging on an excellent president. His great tragedy was that physically he was unable to live out his term. He was good with the Senate. He was good on foreign affairs. He was good with the budget. And I ask, what more do you wish?
When President Harding died, Vice President Calvin Coolidge was at his father's home in rural Vermont. Coolidge's father, a justice of the peace, swore him in by lantern light over the family Bible. Number 30, Calvin Coolidge, Republican, 1923 to 1929, 52 years old, from Massachusetts.
He was a kind of cramped, somewhat mean-spirited, not very sociable or genial man.
Before being tapped as Harding's vice president, Coolidge had been a lawyer and governor of Massachusetts. The man they called Silent Cal was indeed quiet, and when he did speak, it was in a high, nasal voice. Despite claiming that his only hobby was running for office, Coolidge was an avid fisherman. He also had a dry New England wit.
There's a story of him at a state dinner, and a woman sitting next to him trying to engage him says, I'll bet you, Mr. President, that I can get you to say more than 2 words in the course of this evening. And he turned to her briefly and said, you lose.
Coolidge had a novel way of getting exercise by riding this mechanical horse in his White House bedroom.
The president would ride it before dinner in the evening. He would ride the horse and get all sweaty, get off the horse and go down and eat.
History hasn't recorded whether the president preferred to gallop or trot. Although normally stoic, Coolidge was always game to play dress-up for a good photo opportunity. In 1924, less than a year into his presidency, voters were content to keep cool with Coolidge by electing him to a full term of his own. On March 4th, 1925, he was sworn in by Chief Justice William Howard Taft, the first time in history an ex-president gave the oath of office to a president. During his administration, Coolidge kept a tight rein on the federal budget. He used his veto power to kill pay raises for postal workers and bonuses for World War I veterans. He also lowered taxes twice. His goal was to keep government small and business booming.
He believed in American business as the dominant force in American life. He once said, he who builds a factory builds a temple. He who works there worships there.
Coolidge presided over a period of prosperity, but his economic policies failed to anticipate the future and the calamity of the Great Depression that lay ahead.
Coolidge did what the times seemed to require. If he made a mistake, it was in the economics of the time, which he did not understand, and I think most of the people of his generation did not understand.
The president may have missed the increasing signs of economic instability because his management style was to rely heavily on his cabinet.
The case in point was Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury. He was the 3rd richest man in the country, and no recession, not to mention depression, could touch him. And I think he didn't understand what was going on, and Coolidge trusted in Mellon, and thereby made an error.
In 1928, Calvin Coolidge decided not to run for a second term, and his Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, won the White House. Popular in his day, Coolidge is now largely a forgotten figure, a quiet president who presided over a roaring era.
Now, the 1920s was a very unique time period in U.S. history. Now, remember, prior to the 1920s, the world had just ended World War I. It was a devastating war that lasted from 1914 until 1918, and it destroyed much of the continent of Europe. Now, the United States had joined that war in 1917, and after the war, since our nation was not directly affected by all the battles of World War I, our industry stayed intact, and that served as an economic advantage. European nations were rebuilding after this devastating war, and now the United States could supply all the goods necessary for Europe to rebuild their economies. And so during the 1920s, this was a very prosperous decade for the United States. Now, World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. People had the idea if they could just solve the problems that created the conditions that brought the world to war, that our world would be a much better place. But soon people began to realize that that was not the case, that the old problems in Europe continued after World War I. A group of those people who were discouraged by that fact were writers known as the Lost Generation. Now, the Lost Generation refers to that group of writers and artists who came of age during or immediately after World War I, and whose works often reflect a sense of disillusionment and despair after the war. Now, this term was popularized by writers like Gertrude Stein, and also famously described by Ernest Hemingway in his novel The Sun Also Rises. Members of the Lost Generation included F. Scott Fitzgerald, T.S. Eliot, and Zelda Fitzgerald. They grappled with the loss of traditional values, a sense of aimlessness, and the feeling of being disconnected from the pre-war world. Now, their literary output serves as a reflection of the social and cultural upheaval of the 1920s. Now, you may have heard of Ernest Hemingway. He's considered one of the great American writers. He was born in 1899 in Illinois, and he wrote 7 novels, and he also wrote 6 short story collections. Now, Hemingway became very famous in the 1920s, and in the early 30s, he was living in Key West, Florida. Now, Key West is located at the very southern tip of the state of Florida. Today, the community of Key West is a very popular destination for tourists. In fact, one of the most popular spots is the southernmost point of the continental USA. At this spot, they have a big concrete buoy. As you can see on this Google map, here is the spot known as the southernmost point on the continental United States. And as you can see, it is busy with tourists. People love to come down here, stand in line, and get their picture taken by this big 2,000-pound concrete buoy. Some people don't know, though, that Ernest Hemingway lived only 3 blocks from this location. This is Whitehead Street. And if you travel just a few minutes down this street, you will come to the home that Ernest Hemingway lived in while he was here in Key West. Today, his home is a museum that tourists can come to see what life was like for Ernest Hemingway back in the 1930s in Key West. I recently came across this great documentary about Key West and Ernest Hemingway's house. This 4,000-pound concrete buoy marks the most southernmost point on the continental United States. It is located in Key West, Florida. Key West, Florida was home to one of the most famous writers in American history, Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was a part of a group of American writers known as the Lost Generation. The Lost Generation were those people after World War I who had lost faith in the ideas of American progressivism. Hemingway lived on this island about 4 blocks from this point on Whitehead Street. This is the home of Ernest Hemingway, located in Key West. Hemingway and his wife Pauline lived here during the 1930s. Today it is open to the public as a museum and is dedicated to his life as a novelist as well as his time spent in Key West. A unique feature of the property is that there are over 50 polydactyl cats living on the grounds. A polydactyl cat is unique in that it has 6 toes on their front paws. Hemingway received one of these cats as a gift from a ship captain. The first cat was named Snowball, and all the cats living on this property are descendants from the original cat that Hemingway had living on the grounds. This is the backyard of the Hemingway house, one of Ernest Hemingway's favorite locations. 20 feet from the back door stands a 2-story cottage. The second story is where Hemingway wrote some of his most famous novels and short stories, including The Snows of Kilimanjaro and For Whom the Bell Tolls. He loved this backyard because it was big enough to host one of his favorite sporting events, boxing. He set up a boxing ring in the backyard so that he could host matches. In 1937, Hemingway went to Spain to cover the Spanish Civil War. While he was gone, his wife Pauline installed this 62-foot long swimming pool at the cost of $8,000. At the time, that was the only swimming pool in the state of Florida. When Hemingway got back from Spain, he was furious to find out that Pauline had taken his backyard and built such an expensive pool. When he saw the pool, he took out the only thing he had in his pocket, which was 1 penny, and he threw it at Pauline's feet and said, "If you have spent all my money, you might as well have my last red cent." Pauline took the penny that he had thrown at her and embedded it in the concrete in front of the pool. This is the exact location of where she put the penny, and it remains there today. So if you ever get down to Key West, Florida, be sure to stop by the Ernest Hemingway house, pay a visit and see if you can find that penny that's still buried by the pool, and also take a look at those unique cats that are still roaming the grounds. Now, Ernest Hemingway and the Lost Generation were not the only ones that were discouraged with the results of World War I. Remember, World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. In other words, President Wilson said we were going to solve the conflicts of the world. Well, shortly after the war, it became very apparent that we were not going to be able to do that. And so the United States returned to the policy of isolationism. In other words, we were going to stay out of the military and political affairs of Europe. Instead, we were going to pursue a policy in which we, as a nation ourselves, would try to solve some of those problems. And the first big event happened in 1922 when our government called several nations to Washington, D.C. to negotiate 3 treaties. We negotiated what was called the 4-Power Treaty, the 5 Powers Treaty, and the 9 Powers Treaty. These 3 treaties focused on 2 of the things that caused World War I. One thing that caused World War I was militarism, these very large militaries. And we got nations to reduce the size of their militaries in hopes that would prevent them from going to war. And also, one of the reasons World War I started was imperialism. In other words, territorial expansion by nations. And we got several nations to agree to stop doing that. Now you can see on this chart these 3 treaties. Notice at the top it says the Washington Conference. That was the meeting that was held in 1921 and into 1922. And it focuses on territorial expansion and also reducing the size of a nation's military. Notice the first one says the 4-Power Treaty. It was between 4 countries, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Japan. And this was about imperialism. All agreed to respect the other's territory in the Pacific. So it was hoped by agreeing to do this, we would get along better and we would avoid future conflict. Notice the 5-Power Treaty involved the United States, Great Britain, France, Japan, and Italy. Now this one focused on militarism, as you can see. We all agreed to freeze naval production at 1921 levels and to halt production of large warships for 10 years. In other words, we were reducing the size of our military. This was all done by the United States to try to prevent another major conflict in the world. The next major effort that the United States led to try to bring a more peaceful world was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and this occurred in 1928 under the leadership of President Calvin Coolidge. Under this agreement, 62 nations agreed to prohibit war as an instrument of national policy. In other words, they agreed that they would solve their problems peacefully instead of using war as a way to solve their problems. In other words, they agreed to outlaw war. And so the biggest effect of this was that the U.S. sought to limit its involvement in international affairs. Once again, our primary goal was isolationist. We were trying to stay out of the messy affairs on the continent of Europe. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, foreign policy in the United States began to change dramatically. Now, for 100 years or so, from 1823 to 1933, our foreign policy was mainly guided by the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was a foreign policy statement that was articulated by President James Monroe on December 2nd, 1823. The Monroe Doctrine was a U.S. foreign policy that told European powers that they could no longer establish any new colonies or expand their existing ones in the Americas. The doctrine also warned against European interference in the affairs of independent nations in the Americas. It asserted that any such interference would be seen as a threat to the United States and would prompt American action. And this guided our actions with European powers for the rest of the 1800s. Now in 1904, President Teddy Roosevelt issued his own foreign policy, and it was very similar to the Monroe Doctrine. He stated that it was an extension of the Monroe Doctrine, and it became known as the Roosevelt Corollary. The Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine was a significant addition to the United States foreign policy in the early 20th century. It effectively extended the principles of the Monroe Doctrine, which aimed to prevent European colonization and intervention in the Americas. But Roosevelt went beyond the Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt Corollary asserted that in addition to preventing European powers from establishing new colonies or interfering with existing ones in the Western Hemisphere, the United States had the right to intervene in the internal affairs of Latin American countries if they demonstrated instability, financial mismanagement, or the inability to repay their debts to European creditors. In essence, it justified American intervention in Latin America to maintain order and protect its economic interest. This policy was used by Roosevelt and then some other presidents after him as a justification for numerous interventions and military actions in various Latin American countries during the early 20th century, often to protect American business interests and to maintain political stability. It marked a shift in the Monroe Doctrine's original intent, which was focused on external threats, to a more interventionist approach by the United States in the affairs of its neighboring nations. Now, as a result of the Roosevelt Corollary, the United States found itself intervening in other nations' affairs throughout Latin America. This is what's called an interventionist policy. In other words, the United States was intervening in other nations' affairs. And as you can see on this map, there were several times that the United States actually sent troops into other nations, and this often would cause conflicts. Now, a big shift in U.S. foreign policy came with the election of Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was elected to be president in 1932. Now, don't get Franklin Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt confused. Those are two different presidents. Teddy Roosevelt served as president from 1901 until 1909. Franklin Roosevelt served as president from 1933 until 1945. He's the only president that was ever elected more than 2 times. Franklin and Teddy Roosevelt were actually cousins, but in many respects, they had very different political views. So Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932, and when he took office in 1933, he announced a new type of foreign policy. It was to be called the Good Neighbor Policy. Now, President Roosevelt announced his Good Neighbor policy on March the 4th, 1933, during his inaugural address. As with all presidents, he gave a speech outlining his goals as the president. And his major foreign policy goal in regards to Latin America was called the Good Neighbor Policy. Now, the Good Neighbor Policy was almost the exact opposite of the Roosevelt Corollary. Remember, the Roosevelt Corollary was a very aggressive foreign policy, where the United States would actually invade other Latin American nations in order to try to solve a problem that would benefit the United States. But President Franklin Roosevelt completely rejected that with the Good Neighbor Policy. The key points were this. The Good Neighbor Policy emphasized non-interference in internal affairs of Latin American nations, and the United States pledged to respect the sovereignty and self-determination of these countries. Now, the Good Neighbor Policy even went beyond that and focused on economics. It aimed to promote economic cooperation and trade between the United States and its Latin American neighbors. So overall, the Good Neighbor Policy aimed to improve the United States' image in Latin America and build more positive and cooperative relationships with its southern neighbors. So by the early 1930s, the United States' foreign policies focused on 2 goals. One goal was to develop stronger relationships with our Latin American neighbors, and the other goal, of course, was to stay out of the messy political and military affairs of Europe. No one wanted to go back to Europe and fight another world war. But little did anyone know that in the next decade, the 1940s, the United States, even though we were trying to stay out of world conflicts, would once again end up in another world war.